Ukraine just pulled off another bold yet brilliant maneuver, luring Russian troops into the Sumy region before circling around, cutting them off from supply lines and trapping them in a veritable death zone with no way out. It's another tactical victory for Ukraine, another example of Ukrainian intelligence making a mockery of Russian incompetence. And it may very well change the course of the battle in the Sumy and Kursk regions, forcing the Russians onto the back foot and giving Ukraine's armed forces the chance to push on and expand their advantage. Situated in northern Ukraine, the Sumy region was not one of the 4 regions that Russia's President Vladimir Putin originally spoke about annexing when he launched his invasion. Yet, Russian forces have repeatedly targeted this area over the course of the last few years. In fact, on the very first day of the invasion, February 24, 2022, intense clashes broke out in and around Sumy city, which is the administrative center of the Sumy region. Russian forces marched on the city but met stern resistance from Ukrainian paratroopers, territorial defense forces, and even just local volunteers, armed with quite basic equipment. The Russians, meanwhile, brought artillery, tanks, and other armor along with them. On paper, it seemed like a mismatch, yet Ukraine emerged victorious in the end, destroying a Russian tank column and forcing the Kremlin's forces away from the city and eventually out of the region entirely. But Russia hasn't simply left Sumy alone since then. It's regularly bombarded the region, shelling border towns and villages, killing and injuring civilians, and destroying buildings and pieces of civilian infrastructure like farms, schools, and even cemeteries. Russian forces have also carried out numerous cross-border raids as the war has gone by in a desperate attempt to establish a foothold in the Sumy region and perhaps push on towards larger targets like Sumy city itself. Most of these assaults have proven unsuccessful, and even when Russia has managed to capture the odd border town or settlement here and there, Ukraine has often found ways to push them back to square one all over again. In 2024, Ukraine's forces went even further. They didn't just push the Russians back, they followed them over the border, launching the incredible Kursk Offensive and capturing hundreds of square miles of Russian territory, as well as numerous towns and settlements in the process. This offensive eventually fizzled out, but Russia had to dedicate a lot of resources and manpower to recapturing lost land, demining the region, rebuilding damaged infrastructure, and so on. Since then, the Kremlin has become increasingly aggressive in the region. Putin himself spoke on numerous occasions about wanting to establish a buffer or security zone within Sumy in order to guard against another Kursk incursion in the future. And the Russians have amassed a sizable force in the region, with some reports estimating around 50,000 troops in total. The area has since become fiercely contested, and Ukraine's forces have had to use all of their resources with care and plan their strategies down to the finest detail to fend off Russia's assaults. Live tactical maps of the region show that the Kremlin has gained control of some areas, capturing some of the small border settlements that have repeatedly passed from one side to the other over the course of the conflict, like Oleksiivka. In theory, this captured land gives Russia a foothold, a platform from which it can build to push further south and take over more of the Sumy region. There's just one problem with that tactic. Russia's so-called foothold is a narrow patch of land with gaps on either side, and Ukraine just pulled off a stunning move to exploit those very weaknesses, turning what had previously been a defensive effort into an offensive one and leaving Russian troops in no man's land. To the west of the captured section of Sumy, Ukrainian forces have advanced. They've once more crossed the border and entered Russia's region, slowly but surely encircling the zone that the Russians have captured. This in turn opens up new opportunities for Ukrainian troops to flank the Russians, striking them from numerous sides all at once in order to catch them off guard and either wipe them out or send them running back to Russia as fast as their feet will carry them. To support this offensive maneuver, Ukraine has relied heavily on aerial strikes. Over the course of recent weeks, Kyiv's forces have carried out numerous airborne attacks on Russian positions in both occupied Sumy areas and further back into Kursk. As seen on countless other occasions throughout the war so far, when it comes to airstrikes and drone attacks, Ukraine puts a lot of thought, planning and intelligence into choosing its targets and launching its weapons at just the right times to deal maximum damage. It's followed that same philosophy here, identifying key strategic locations like Russian command centers or supply routes before taking them out with peerless precision. This in turn has resulted in openings emerging, allowing Ukrainian ground units to push on and break through defensive lines, gaining ground to the north, and just recently, Ukraine's Black Swan Battalion shared footage of Russian aircraft attempting to bomb new Ukrainian positions northeast of the village of Kindrativka. This demonstrates two important points. First, it shows just how far Ukraine has managed to advance. When Russia first managed to capture several border towns and settlements in Sumy, many analysts expected the country's forces would fortify their position, establish a firm stronghold, then slowly expand outwards, taking more slivers of land over time. Instead, Ukraine has managed to carve a huge hole right into the Russian position and regain lost ground. Second, it shows how Russia's ability to maintain pressure and momentum in the area is growing weaker by the day. Despite Putin's bold proclamations of buffer zones and the massive numbers of Russian troops in the area, the country is barely able to hold on to even the slimmest slivers of Sumy land. And this isn't a one-off incident either. There have been many situations in 2025 where Russian forces crossed into Sumy and captured a village, only to be outthought and outmaneuvered by Ukraine and sent straight back to the drawing board to rethink their next plan of attack. Russian commanders most likely assumed that they'd be able to build on their Sumy foothold this time around, but instead it's Ukraine that's now pushing deeper into Russian territory, isolating the Kremlin's brigades and leaving Russia with tactical problems to solve and no obvious solutions presenting themselves. Ukraine hasn't just shown tactical superiority in Sumy, its forces are also demonstrating extraordinary levels of military innovation, using some truly groundbreaking hardware to weaken Russian positions. Hardware like the vampire hexacopter, nicknamed Baba Yaga by the Russians in reference to the child-eating witch of Slavic folklore. Equipped with infrared cameras that allow them to easily see in any conditions and spot Russian soldiers wherever they hide, these drones can carry warheads weighing up to 15 kilograms or around 33 pounds, with some variants able to handle closer to 20 kilograms. That makes them far more dangerous than more basic lightweight drones, which tend to carry simple improvised explosive devices. Vampires can deal extensive amounts of damage wherever they strike, and Ukraine regularly uses them for long-range nighttime missions, transporting devastating ordnance like anti-tank mines or mortar rounds to drop on Russia's troops, vehicles, or other assets. Ukrainian engineers have even taken the Vampire to new levels by developing a new drone-dropped munition, nicknamed the Black Hole Bomb. It was developed by the aforementioned Black Swan unit and comes in two distinct variants, thermobaric and fragmentation. The thermobaric bomb produces a high-temperature blast wave that first disperses a fuel cloud, then ignites it, creating an intense overpressure. After the blast, the rapid pressure drop pulls air back in, which can suffocate troops caught in the radius and obliterate enemy fortifications in an instant. The fragmentation bomb, meanwhile, detonates in the air in order to scatter a shower of lethal shrapnel across a wide zone, quickly clearing out entire squadrons of enemy troops on the move or emptying enemy trenches. Images from the front lines show these black hole bombs in action, with huge craters left behind after they've exploded and Russian firing points wiped off the map in the blink of an eye. They're extraordinarily effective, boasting the same explosive firepower as artillery shells, yet able to be precisely placed exactly where Ukraine wants, courtesy of their Vampire drones. And there's no telling how Ukraine could go on to use this innovative and explosive combo of drones and bombs to even greater effect, not just in Sumy, but elsewhere along the front lines. It could, for example, deploy similar hardware in other regions, like Donetsk and Zaporizhia, to dismantle Russian defenses without having to rely so heavily on artillery. It could even use these drones and black hole bombs in the many precise deep strikes it launches regularly on high-value targets on Russian soil or in occupied territories like Crimea, destroying Russian radars, air defense systems, aircraft, command posts and more, leaving the Kremlin with yet more broken and blown up equipment and an even deeper hole in its economy. For now, however, much of Ukraine's focus remains on Sumy, and the country has a clear mission: to cut off the Russian occupying forces and take them out one after another. And they're already succeeding. While Russia has concentrated large number of its troops in a relatively small section of the Sumy region, Ukraine has opted for a more tactical divide and conquer approach, sending its own brigades in different directions to get around and behind the Russian positions, rather than wasting time and sacrificing troops in an aggressive frontal push. Supported by its aerial strike campaigns, Ukraine has gradually managed to wear down Russia's presence here. Day by day, its forces methodically maneuver to cut off isolated groups of Russian troops before moving in to finish the job. Meanwhile, other Ukrainian troops push onwards into Kursk, giving the Russians yet another front to defend. While Ukraine has a clear plan of action and is executing it flawlessly, Russian commanders appear utterly incapable of solving several problems at the same time. Again, this is a recurring trend seen throughout the war, with the Kremlin so often relying on just one simple tactic: brute force. It's consistently attempted to use its superior manpower and larger military to just overwhelm Ukraine all along the front lines, banking on its bigger numbers of soldiers, tanks, and other military hardware to get the job done. Ukraine, meanwhile, has been remarkably adaptable and tactical. Understanding it has a smaller force and fewer resources, it knew it wouldn't win a head-to-head fight. Instead, it had to innovate to succeed and surprise its enemy to gain any sort of advantage in this war. That's been true for the entire war, and the situation in Sumy is a perfect microcosm of the much larger state of play. Once more, there have been clear signs of Russian stubbornness and an utter unwillingness to adjust tactics, even when things aren't working out the way it wanted, along with signs of Ukrainian ingenuity and adaptability. Thanks to that, Russian forces are being eliminated, and Ukraine is taking full advantage of the changing face of the borderlands battlefield. In truth, despite what maps might say, there really isn't a clear defined border here anymore. The border this area once knew is now nothing but a vague reference line. Instead, for the troops on the ground, be they Russian or Ukrainian, this territory is simply a contested jumble of small settlements, villages, dusty roads, and crater-filled farming fields. It's not about controlling the border, it's simply about controlling the land and being on the right side of the momentum. That's why Ukraine has, on the face of it, allowed Russia to push into Sumy, only to then sweep around behind them and make gains in Kursk. It's all part of a larger tactical plan, one that ignores state lines and border boundaries and focuses instead of taking the land that matters the most and gaining whichever positions are most strategically important at the time. The layout of the land also works in Ukraine's favour here. As stated, the area on either side of the border between Sumy and Kursk is largely isolated and rural. Towns and villages here tend to be very small and sparse, with some little more than a single road with a few houses and buildings on either side, separated by patches of fields, tree lines, and agricultural land. With the urban areas so scattered and spread out, Ukrainian troops are able to locate passages within Russian defensive lines to maneuver around and encircle enemy positions. And in the space of just a few days, Russian troops go from holding positions of power to being trapped in death zones, with Ukrainians closing in on them from all angles. Cut off from their fellow units and without any clear supply lines coming in or out to provide reinforcements or a means of escape, these soldiers have little hope but to either fight for their lives or wave the white flag. And if Ukraine is able to persist with this tactic, two things will happen. First, the occupied villages in Sumy will once more be liberated. Places like Oleksiivka and nearby areas once considered grey zones, such as Kindrativka, which Ukrainian sources reported as secured in late July 2025, will return to Ukraine's control and the Russians will be taken out or pushed back. This will provide another big morale boost to Ukraine's defenders as they liberate their land, while leaving the Russians scratching their heads and wondering how they got it all so wrong once again. Second, Ukraine will likely not stop at liberating Sumy. Its forces are already in Kursk, so may be tempted to push on and repeat their offensive maneuvers of 2024, taking over land and settlements in Russia itself, humiliating Putin by making a buffer zone of their own on Russian soil when it should have been the other way around, according to the Kremlin. And all the signs are there to suggest that this is exactly what will happen because it's already in process. Battered and beaten by Ukraine's aerial bombardments and drone strikes, and cut off from supplies and aid, Russian troops in Sumy, and even those further back in Kursk, are proving utterly unable to mount any sort of coherent, consistent defensive effort. With Ukraine now advancing in so many positions, the situation is only set to get worse for the Kremlin's troops, and many may decide that it's better to lay down their arms and hand themselves over to their enemy rather than die in pointless pockets of land they have no hope of holding in the long term. Overall, Sumy is witnessing a truly staggering shift of momentum. For a long time, the narrative appeared clear. Russia was advancing. It had the bigger force, a bold mission to build a buffer over the border, and more support than Ukraine could muster, especially given the fact that Ukraine is also having to fight even fiercer battles in areas like Pokrovsk and other frontline locations to the east. It appeared that the Ukrainian forces would simply have to dig in as best as they could, hold off the assaults from their enemy, and slow down their progress, while inevitably losing little bits of land as the days and weeks went by. But Ukraine said no to that idea. Because for Ukraine, every bit of territory matters. Whether it's Sumy, Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, it's all just as valuable, and Ukrainian people will defend every bit of it to their last breath. They refused to give up stretches of Sumy territory to their enemy, and instead hatched a plan to push them out and stop them getting back in. And so far, it's working, and the fight is moving bit by bit back from Sumy and into Kursk. The Ukrainian soldiers in the area have even earned the utmost respect and admiration from their country's president, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who took to social media on September 14 to express his gratitude for the brave defenders of the Sumy region. As of today, we can state that Russia's offensive operation on Sumy has been completely derailed by our forces. Fighting continues along the Sumy border, but the Russian grouping in this direction has lost its offensive capabilities as a result of sustained losses. With Ukraine continuing to innovate in drone warfare and find ways to turn the odds in its favor, even when it appears to be facing insurmountable challenges, there's no telling how far it could go from here. The coming months could bring an even bigger and more impactful Kursk incursion in the months ahead, or Ukraine might prefer to simply liberate all of Sumy once and for all before reinforcing its border defenses to stop Russia coming back next time. Either way, Ukrainian forces appear to be well and truly in the ascendancy here and elsewhere, spelling bad news for Putin and potentially paving the way towards an even more successful end-of-year period for Kyiv. Now, find out even more about how bad the situation is becoming for Russia in our recent look at how the country's much talked about summer offensive has, in fact, turned into a summer of defeat, with over 200,000 troops lost in the process. Alternatively, check out how Putin and his commanders are so desperate that they've even started sending cooks to serve and die on the front lines of Ukraine in order to cope with the massive casualties and losses they've suffered so far this year. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications too, so you can be among the first to find out about the latest big news and developments from the front lines of Ukraine and other important military and geopolitical events elsewhere around the world.